Recording in progress.
This year is actually Malaysia's VNR, so we've been 45 years country. I understand the VNR team is visiting Sarawak after the next which will be interesting if you can try and attend and also make sure invited. So that is your ability to truly sexual process. The other thing I want to mention is some localities also with the SDGs formally. There's also kind of sideline UN process for that too, which is they call the voluntary local review. So at the current time, 7 Malaysian cities have reported, and even one state, Sarawak, is also being maybe will be a good idea also for Sarawak to take this up to this one discuss reporting on the next slide. So let's look at the data where exactly are we right now on achieving goals. The two circles look quite different because they're kind of similar, but I'm best friend. So firstly, the global enemy circle, which is records progress globally, reported in the global SDG report from the Secretary General last year's summit in September, October last year. And then I've also given you the data from Malaysia reported by the SDG Centre, which is part of the Ministry of Economy. So if we look at the first circle, you can see very dramatically that things do not look good. The SDGs are in serious trouble, right? And we're only 5 years before the end of the goals, which goes well into 2041. We're going to interpret the goals. So the green portion, 70% are those SDG targets. We're calling the SDGs are made of 17 goals, but 169 targets below them. So only 17% are judged as being on track to be achieved. Not being achieved, but on track to be achieved. That actually is very, very problematic. And then you can see kind of good progress in relevant portions, and then very severely strained performance in the last two colors of pink in the left. And the pink for stagnation, regression, in other words, these targets actually going backwards on the base here. This is very, very troublesome. It's about 17% on track, at the same time, 35% actually regress in all of the efforts. That is very, very challenging, and something which needs to be addressed very urgently in the recent SDG summits. Focus has been very much on acceleration. So not so bad in Malaysia. I think with the Malaysian chart, reduced by the Ministry of Economy, this is tracking from Malaysia. You can see from Malaysia, the equivalent portion, 43% are on track, and 30% are off track. Malaysia doesn't do this gradation at all. The yellow in Malaysia chart is actually missing data, so they also report where they don't have data to make a judgment on the target. Also an issue, but not quite a bad issue, as it's being regressing. So, in fact, if you exclude data that's missing and the data which is not applicable, kind of a dark grey portion, actually Malaysia looks even better, around 60% on track. Okay, so really need to compare something like 60 with this 17 on this side. So actually for Malaysia, looking sure it's a lot better, okay, but you would expect that to be the case. You know, so we're well aware Malaysia is an upper-middle-income country, approaching a high potential status, very close to the threshold, and it's the kind of performance you would expect to see for a country like Malaysia. But I'll give you the data, and the reason I do this also is to underline that there are still some issues. So it's 30% actually where there are issues, and these are the goals which need to be addressed and moved towards the year 2030 or the next 5 years. To just review, focusing on problem goals, let's go to the next slide. And these are the set of goals that the SDG Centre has identified as being one of the performance issues in Malaysia needs to accelerate and focusing on the important causes and the approximate causes of the performance. So they are firstly hunger and nutrition, SDG2, and this is an interesting set of circumstances here. Malaysia has both problems of stunting, malnutrition, but it also has started to see obesity as well. Typically for countries who one or the other, we don't often see both, but Malaysia has this double challenge to stunting. So it needs to be addressed. Second event is gender, is the women's empowerment goal. And there are a series of issues here. A primary one, of course, is women in the economy. Women's participation rate in the labour force in Malaysia is relatively low, only 57% or so, versus over 80% for men. So, and you can also see this in women, especially in business, in leadership and senior roles is an issue. But there are also other issues around policies, around equality and so forth. Now, the drivers of this are more complex than we come to our aid, right? It's not simply about social norms. It's more about the availability of childcare and the availability of services that enable women to participate more fully. You also see in Malaysian data a lack of reporting here. There's a lack of data sources as well to make judgments on this goal. Third one is inequality. Malaysia has historically had relatively high levels of inequality since its independence. There are kind of two dimensions for this, two dominant dimensions. The first is, of course, around the differences between different communities in Malaysia, but also spatial inequality. Simply the spatial component is very significant in Malaysia. Just exactly where you are, and I think as Eastern Malaysians who know this very, very well. And that's a reality, and those two dimensions need to be tackled urgently in Malaysia to close the gap on inequality. Fourth is climate change, climate action, a pivotal goal for the world, right? And as you'll see in any analysis, if I probed down in the global numbers or even in the regional data, this goal is a problem for all countries. Malaysia's emissions are still too high, and its efforts on adaptation are still not sufficient. So Malaysia urgently needs to tackle the amount of carbon it's emitting. I know less so of an issue for Sarawak, trust me. But and I also know the government is counting on Sarawak to come to the rescue in delivering green energy. But this is still an issue for Malaysia as a whole. Of course, also on the adaptation side, you can already see the impacts of weaker adaptation measures in the level of loss and damage that is incurred during flooding events currently in Peninsular Malaysia. So these are very, very important issues. Luckily, within this goal, Malaysia's performance on the policy response is much stronger. With the federal government adopting the National Energy Transition Roadmap, for example, they're very serious policy efforts. The government committing to net zero by 2050. Finally, there are a set of issues in SDG 16. SDG 16 is titled Peace, Justice, Strong Institutions. It's really kind of a governance goal, and there are a host of issues here about the inclusiveness, responses of decision making, the rule of law, and some issues around human trafficking as well, a suite of different smaller issues within this SDG also. Now, I also want to convey on the remaining goals, for example, I haven't listed the goals where Malaysia is doing well, something like education, where Malaysia performs very, very strongly. I want to reiterate, while these are priorities, and they need to be really concentrated on as we move forward in the policy space and in implementation, it's also important to keep up with where you are now, right? As I said, those goals are on track to be achieved, the targets are on track to be achieved, but they are not yet achieved. So it's also important that Malaysia continues on the wider SDG agenda as well as addressing these priorities. Okay, next slide. Okay, so now I'll try and talk about progress in Sarawak. And I also have to admit at the start of this section that I have somewhat reduced my ambition. Initially, I was hoping to try and look at Sarawak data and develop some targets, but that proved very, very challenging. And so therefore, what I'm going to try and do is present a comparison against Malaysia's performance. But I also, I want to underline at the outset that if I am to track performance, the way one does that is one compares
data, actual numbers, with target data. Okay, so I need both of those. And that is very, very challenging at a state level in Malaysia. So we have quite a truncated local data set that DOSM publish for all states. So we have some SDG data, but still on the other side, we need targets. Okay, and I think this is something I would urge Sarawak to look at, because Sarawak still does not have state level targets, because you need to compare the two to know where you're at in terms of developing an accurate assessment of your performance to date. It's something which the UN is working on as well, and it's something we would like to have a dialogue about. Nevertheless, having said that, it is possible to compare Sarawak's SDG performance against Malaysia's SDG performance and reach some basic conclusions about the relativities between the two. Obviously, we need to understand that's relative to Malaysia's overall SDG performance, and as I've just shown, Malaysia has performance and issues on several of the goals. So we go to the next slide. What does that reveal? So I basically looked at every single one of the SDGs, and I've looked at target level, and I tried to track performance between Sarawak and between Malaysia, and I grouped them into three categories. Actually, there are four. The fourth category is there's not enough data, so we can dispense from those. There's two goals that simply lack sufficient data. I'm not really able to comment on those, but I find there is 4.5 goals where it appears that Sarawak is somewhat lagging behind Malaysia as a whole, around the averages for Malaysia. There are 7 goals where it's virtually very, very similar in terms of its performance. And then I find a further 3.5 where Sarawak appears to appear better than the Malaysian average. And these are just shown on the slide. The reason there is a half is because the health goal, sometimes Sarawak does better and sometimes Sarawak does worse. Okay, and I was going to allocate it, but the differences are incredibly strong, right? So what you find is for this health goal, the health goal includes indicators on both communicable diseases and non-communicable diseases. So non-communicable disease is something like cancer, diabetes, heart disease, and so forth. And there Sarawak performs a lot better than than Malaysia as a whole, right? And yet on the other side, for communicable disease, then Sarawak's performance is weaker. So that's why I've divided the goal between the two. So anyway, this gives you a flavor of the relative performance. I think it also gives you a signal of the kind of goals that Sarawak should concentrate on. And of course, those are at the top. Issues around poverty, although poverty has declined very dramatically, particularly after the end of the COVID pandemic, it still somewhat lags Malaysia's average number. Sarawak is by no means the worst state in Malaysia, you know, very much towards the upper end of the table, but still kind of lags the average somewhat. I've explained on health already. Some issues around water sanitation. Growth is an interesting one because it's very, very much prioritized in the post-COVID development strategy, but still not quite meeting the targets that Sarawak set itself. Because obviously Sarawak is in a catch-up position, but it's doing well. I still put it there because if you look, the data still lags somewhat a little bit behind Malaysia, and GDP per capita is still lower. And then, of course, there are also linked to that issues in terms of industry and so forth. And then you can see the goals where it's very similar. Food, nutrition, education, gender, clean energy production, clean production and consumption, life below water, and then of course partnership for goals, and then the areas where it excels better, as I've explained, on health, on non-communicable disease. Inequality actually is lower in Sarawak than is Malaysia as a whole. Also, the governance position is a bit better on SDG 16, and then also much better on life on land. Okay, so that gives you a basic steer about the issues I think that Sarawak faces in terms of the SDGs, which is a little bit more distinct than Malaysia's. But also, I also want to emphasize, and I'll do this again and again, is that Sarawak as a part of Malaysia also needs to contribute towards Malaysia's SDG success. And I think, as I already said, Putrajaya is very, very much looking to Sarawak to deliver on green energy and on the environmental goals. Next slide, please. Okay, so now I was going to look a little bit at the policy response, particularly at the post-COVID development strategy, and its linkages to the SDGs. Now, while the strategy is very economically focused, it has very, very strong SDG alignment. I think of all the plans I've seen in Malaysia, this one is the most strongly SDG aligned. And that comes, I think, from its three core components about inclusive society, environmental sustainability, and economic prosperity. And they literally map directly onto the UN classifies the SDGs in terms of 5 Ps, okay? And it directly maps onto the people, planet, and prosperity Ps. We group the SDGs, and we also have the partnership and peace. But these themes map directly between the development strategy and the SDG framework. So around its core components, also around its time frame to 2030, and its aspirations, towards a fully developed society, a society in the wider sense, not simply crossing an income threshold, but being developed in terms of the social, in terms of the environmental. So I think in terms of philosophy, even though it is rather economically focused, it maps on very well. Interestingly, the development strategy doesn't point this out. If you go to Malaysia plan, they list the goal alignments directly, somewhat in a rather awkward way. But I think if it was done for the development strategy here in Sarawak, this would be much clearer. I think also the 7 strategic thrusts can be mapped to individual SDGs, as I'll do shortly. And you can also relate the policies to the SDG targets. So let's go to the next slide. I've done this on the next slide. I've tried to align where all the goals line up against the strategic thrust. And you can see there's a pretty good correspondence. They all find a home. The only one I didn't give a home to was the partnership goal, but that's really about partnerships to deliver, and partnerships with other areas and other countries. So you can see, but very much most of them lining up on either environmental sustainability and social inclusivity, these thrusts 6 and 7. But also you can see the goals are relevant as well throughout the agenda set out in the post-COVID-19 development strategy. So a very, very strong basis for Sarawak's alignment with the goals, and which is very, very positive. And I think it's something that can be built on as we address the kind of topics I'll come to now about using SDG tools and using SDG partnerships to further the goals. So next slide. Okay, so in this fourth section, I'm going to talk about using SDG tools and frameworks in the context of the strategy, about how Sarawak might go forward in delivering SDG acceleration. Pardon me. So the first I wanted to talk about is around target setting and monitoring and evaluation. I've already mentioned to you that Sarawak doesn't have its own SDG targets. This would be a good place to start, right? And I think the place to look naturally is in the development strategy. So you already have the data. I think you can draw SDG targets from the development strategy. And this doesn't mean you contradict the global SDG framework of 169 targets under the 17 goals. It just means you're adapting them to the local context, as member states and localities are able to do. And I've given you in the graphic how you would then use these to track progress through time. I've given you actually a graphic that depicts for Malaysia as a whole its poverty trajectory. So the blue line on the chart, and you can see the chart really runs from 2015 to 2030. Okay, and the orange line is the target trajectory, because Malaysia's objective with poverty is to halve poverty, right? So you can see it's falling from the baseline. And then, so that's the orange line, and then the blue line is the actual data, what happened to the poverty rate in Malaysia. And you have the dotted line is the trend, okay. Now for this one, the judgment is that Malaysia is off track because the data and the trend is still above the target line. So this kind of exercise needs to be repeated in Sarawak for Sarawak's data for each one of the indicators below the targets in order to reach a judgment on the targets. But again, as I emphasized before, to do this properly, you need targets as well as the data set. The other thing I think worth mentioning, that's on the data side, on the hard number side, and that will enable you to produce the kind of barometer I showed for the globe and for Malaysia. On the other side, as well as the number work, it's useful to provide a qualitative analysis of progress, stories from the ground, stories from the grassroots about how SDG performance is panning out. And a good source for that is the work of the All Parliamentary Group on the SDGs, which has some, also has MPs, YBs in Sarawak that are members of this group. And they produce profiles for localities about their SDG performance. They also have some grant money to deliver SDG priorities. And perhaps you could check it out on the link at a later stage. Okay, next tool I wanted to talk about is SDG reporting. I mentioned this already at the start. Globally, we have a series of voluntary national reviews that countries produce every 4 or 5 years. This year is Malaysia's 3rd VNR. I've given you the pictures of the first 2 VNRs. Hopefully, if you click on them, if we share the PowerPoint, you can access those. They're public documents. These are produced Malaysia-wide. The current one is being produced, and they go to every single state and consult. Those are then consolidated, and they present these in New York to a panel of peer countries. So the Minister, Rafiza Ramli, in Malaysia's case, will present to a group of peer countries, and they will get to question and answer on about Malaysia's performance. In addition, I explained there's also this system of reports below that called the voluntary local review, and I could find these. I could only find 3. I'm told there are 7 cities, but I give you the one for Shah Alam, one for Subang Jaya, and also the Selangor state level VLR. And I think this is also a useful thing that Sarawak might think about, producing its own state level VLR that really concentrates on the state's SDG progress for reporting. Okay, next slide. I also want to talk about finance. In addition to this, I also need to explain that in addition to the standard SDGs, there are a set of means implementation targets. So when you look at an SDG framework, the first set of targets are all about the goal itself, say education. There will be ones on enrollment, on attainment, and so forth in the top part of the table. Each SDG also includes metrics that measure means of implementation. And those are questions around things like finance. And finance is the most significant one. So I also wanted to talk about finance for the goals. Clearly, public investment is crucial for delivering the SDGs, but also private sector flows, okay, and contributions from civil society, very important. But finance is really center stage in terms of delivering the SDGs. There are various tools around SDG finance. We could have a whole day talking about them, but I just wanted to offer you 2 practical ones. And these speak to the 2 key issues within finance. Finance is either about the quantum, i.e. the amount of money that you raise to support the SDGs, literally the spending that you need to close these gaps. And then secondly, all about its distribution. What is it used for, between different goals, right? Is it matching up with the priorities? And the 2 examples I quote should be useful to that. The first is what they call SDG budgeting. This is a system of accounting. So in addition to using account codes within the state budget, within the public budget, within Sarawak's public budget, for example, you use SDG codes. So every single expenditure is allocated towards an SDG, right? Now the federal government have done this for Malaysia. Sadly, they didn't publish it. It's in the Chief Secretary's presentation, but it's not actually within the budget documentation. Like I'm able to source that chart if people would like to see how they did it. But it gives an SDG breakdown across the goals, what the federal government is spending its money on. And this can be very useful because it reveals the embedded priorities in the budget that just happened because the way budget setting works, and you can then compare those to the priorities to see if they marry up and where adjustments could be made. The other thing I wanted to quote is private sector finance. On the other side, much more about raising the amount of money to support the SDGs, because clearly when we think of the private sector, SDGs is not only about public sector delivery, it's also about private sector flows, right? So for businesses, about whether they invest in SDG projects, whether they're SDG compliant in their conduct, whether they're good corporate citizens, and it's vital we lever the private sector in delivering the SDGs. And an interesting publication is the Malaysia Investor Map on this, which is a UNDP-sponsored publication with the federal government. This maps SDG opportunities, so investment opportunities around SDG objectives for businesses, where businesses can take up projects and invest. I think it lists some Sarawak opportunities. If you download the map, you can see those, and this is very useful in promoting business investment for the goals. Okay, next slide. Okay, before I close, I'm going to talk about partnerships as well, before we can have a discussion. I want to begin with the UN, but I'll run through civil society and business and so forth as key partners for delivering the goals. So the UN is not so active in Sarawak, because Sarawak, I guess, is not a lagging state in that sense. Often the UN's activities are more focused on the more lagging states. For example, there's a lot of activity, for example, in Sabah. But there is still UN project activity in Sarawak. And I think it's something we could work with the state government to enhance the level of UN spending on projects. Now, I've given you a link there, the UN info. If you click on that link, it'll give you a map of Malaysia, and it shows you where all UN projects are delivered in Malaysia. But there are, I found 3 prominent ones in Sarawak. One is around electric vehicles, delivered by UNIDO. UNICEF are working with the state government on social protection, on cash transfers and cash plus assistance. And UNDP are working on wildlife protection. So already 3 substantial UN projects in the state, and it would be good if we could expand those. And the UN is very keen to have a dialogue on how it can attune its projects, particularly in Eastern Malaysia. I also want to mention the UN SDG Trust Fund. This is a fund which gives out grants every year to NGOs and CSOs. It's managed jointly by the UN and the federal government, and the federal government's still the largest contributor to the fund, and they give out around $4 to $5 million a year, I guess 20 million ringgit plus, and this is allocated to universities, to NGOs, to CSOs who have SDG-ready projects. So if any of you are here today from an NGO or a non-governmental institution like a university, you're free to apply to the fund. We have several universities receiving money, and we're in our 2nd year of allocations. Sadly, the fund's allocation window has just been completed, and the awards have just been made in January. But it will begin again, from July, August onwards, with decisions taking place in October, November. So please apply this year. If people are interested, they can see me afterwards. Okay, so the next partnership I want to discuss is civil society. Obviously, civil society is a vital partner for delivering the goals. CSOs and NGOs are central to SDG efforts, and they fulfill 2 functions. They both represent groups, reminding you of the need to leave no one behind. They represent groups, particularly vulnerable communities who need to access SDG benefits. And they're also involved in delivering service to those groups. So they're both representatives and deliverers of SDG outcomes. And therefore, it's kind of a systemic part of delivering the goals. They need to be part of SDG consultations, and they need to be part of SDG efforts. I think I also need to recognize in Malaysia that civil society is very well developed. And I've given you, there's a whole group of CSOs who support the SDGs as part of the Malaysian SDG Alliance, the CSO Alliance. And I'm told they have an active membership here in Sarawak. They have a Facebook page. I looked last night. And I've given you their policy brief, which was published last year, which is a very much NGO-style take on the SDGs, actually much more critical than the UN and the government, but you would expect that from CSOs. But they're crucial partners, and the UN tries to engage them in all our projects. And, for example, in the VNR process, the government takes efforts to include and hear the views of CSOs and NGOs. Next slide. Okay, perhaps the most challenging partnership and the most important one is with the private sector. Because as I've explained, finance is crucial to delivery of the goals. And the financing question is not, again, as I said, only about public sector finance. It's also about levering private sector finance, into delivering the goals. And of course, additionally, as well as the financing question, there is the question of business conduct, of enterprises conduct. Enterprises, their behaviors, in terms of their production, how green they are, how they abide by labor law, how they respect their employees and their neighbors within the community, are all central concerns for the SDGs. So in terms of the private sector, we're engaging both on their conduct in business and also on their ability to invest in SDG relevant projects and investment areas. Okay, so SDGs, I want to start by saying that SDGs sit very well actually with ESG, which if people are aware, ESG is economic, social governance dimensions of business conduct. And there is a whole field of ESG work about making businesses compliant with economic, social governance standards. Those fit very well with the SDGs. So they're kind of like the how-to, whereas the SDGs are the what. The SDGs are the targets that we want to achieve. But these ESG frameworks that businesses developed, and I've given you a chart, they're a very basic chart, which kind of allocates the goals to these ESG questions. And ESG has standards, it has reporting standards, accounting standards, which companies are increasingly adhering to. And they're adhering to not only because they're in accounting standards in the formal accounting practice, they're often also specified in trade agreements. And they're also specified, they also enable businesses to get cheaper credit. So these are very significant. In doing this, I think a key partner within the private sector is the chambers of commerce. These are great places to engage with business if you're government on the SDGs. And the one I really want to mention is the United Nations Global Compact. I know it says UN in the title, but it's kind of a UN business interface. This is very much run by business people. And I've given you there some links to their website, to the global website, to the Malaysia chapter, Malaysia and Brunei chapter of the Global Compact. And Sarawakian companies are very active in this network, generally the larger ones. And the focus, I think, on a lot of these efforts, particularly on compliance, is to move towards medium, small enterprises, because of the large enterprises are usually stronger on ESG. And the middle link is useful, the SDG Compass. This is a free resource. Now, a large company will hire a group of consultants to ensure that its business activity is SDG compliant. This tool is for free, produced by the Global Compact for a medium or a smaller enterprise to kind of carry out kind of SDG audit of its own activities to make sure it's compliant. And there are advantages of doing that. Let me go to the next slide. I think, when you go to business, in addition to repeating the spiel I've given you about good corporate citizenship and abiding by the goals, you also need to make a business case for the SDGs. Okay, and I think there is one out there, and I think that it's very true that, as the headline says, by doing good, doing good is also good for the bottom line. Okay, so there is a business case also for signing up to the SDGs and abiding by the SDGs. And on the contribution side, businesses are expected to, ensure their conduct is commensurate with the SDGs, but also through SDG compliant corporate behavior, but also by investing, as I've said, in SDG activities. And what are the payoffs of that? I think there are financial payoffs at different levels. Firstly, there's, as I've said, you have a compliance with trade regulations. If you're an exporter, places like the European Union, the United States, and so forth, have requirements around environmental requirements and around labor law. The SDGs help you be compliant with those standards, which would avoid any trade restrictions or customs hold on your exports. And that has happened to some Malaysian companies. I agree, not in Sarawak, but certainly the palm oil sector, for example, by non-compliance. There have been significant customs holds in the US, Canada, and Europe. By complying with the SDGs, also businesses are able to access much cheaper finance. Okay, there's this whole branch of finance known as impact finance. If companies are able to comply and report socially and environmentally, they're able to access much cheaper financial investments through impact financing. So compliance will enable you to apply to those financial institutions that offer these kind of loans and investments. And of course, there are big marketing gains, right, that are available to businesses. That none of the SDG logos is copyrighted. People are free to use them on their products. Governments are free to use them. But clearly, by signing up to the goals and using the logos, you deliver a marketing edge, which is very powerful with consumers. And I think the important thing also to underline that the goals themselves, with their framework of targets, is a ready-made framework that businesses can use. Okay. Final thoughts. Okay, I promised 45 minutes, almost exactly. Maybe 1 minute before. Just some final thoughts, I think, also perhaps to guide our discussion. I think first and foremost, I want to reiterate, we really are at the 11th hour, okay, in terms of the SDGs. We have literally 5 years to go. And I've made very clear at all levels, including the Malaysia level, there are still serious gaps to be addressed, and there's an urgent need to accelerate progress on the goals. But I think coming to Sarawak, this state is uniquely positioned to make a contribution for itself and for Malaysia, particularly on the environmental area, but also in certain other areas also, in terms of its commitment to, for example, the social and the economic interface. I also want to recognize Sarawak's very strong commitment to the SDGs. It's very strong in the post-COVID-19 development strategy. This is very positive. It provides a building block for SDG acceleration, which is really what we're seeking now to deliver the goals. I think it can make, again, as I've said, a very strong contribution to Malaysia's achievement of the SDGs. And this is really being counted on nationally from Sarawak. As we move forward in the final years, I also want to underline again the importance of these kind of means of implementation efforts, these around financing, around planning, around governance. It's important these things have got right if we are to see accelerated performance. And very finally, I close, I want to recognize Sarawak also has challenges. I showed you, I think, some of the goals which should be prioritized, but I think it has all the ingredients for SDG success. And the resources, physical and human capital, but crucially, something I haven't mentioned, I think it has the will to succeed, and it has very strong political leadership on these issues. So I will close there. Thank you for your attention. I'm very happy to take any further questions you might have.
Thank you, Dr. Richard Marshall. Your expertise has certainly provided us with valuable perspective on how we can integrate sustainability into the development strategies. Now we'd like to open the floor for Q&A session, or if you would like to share your thoughts and opinion, the team has set up the microphone at the stairs to your left and right. If you have questions or opinion, whatever that is that you would like to share, please come to the mic and kindly state your name and organization, followed by your question, thoughts, and opinion. Thank you.
Yes, please don't be shy. I notice you all sit at the back. It's like being back in university, right? Yeah.
Well, morning, and thank you, Dr. Richard, for very enlightening sharing this morning. I would like to seek your opinion on the geopolitical and global trends, where I think nationalism, regionalism, or even civic nationalism on the other side, whereas SDG is supposed to be goals for the humanity, where we are expected to work together on our shared targets and values, but they are the other side of humanity, which are very nationalistic and even regionalistic. And I think recently, since it's supposed to be the only superpower is going the other way, how do you see moving forward to 2030? Thank you.
Okay, a very, very controversial question. Maybe I shouldn't ask for controversial questions. I'll do my best to answer, but obviously it's a little above my pay grade to speak for the UN collectively. I think you highlight a very significant trend, right, in world affairs. It would be ridiculous for me to deny that. Okay, and I think, but we've seen this kind of thing before, right? And I think it's not so different. We've seen some very severe geopolitical upheavals. I imagine you're referring to the recent spat of disputes over Ukraine and trade relations, right? Okay, so we saw it around Ukraine, the conflict. We saw also the conflict in Palestine. It was also very, very controversial. My own take on these things is, that this is part of a rocky path, right, that the world goes through. Okay, and we're in this situation now, and I don't want to deny the pressures exist. But I think the goals, and last year they were updated in terms of what we had, the global pact, the Pact to the Future, which was a UN multilateral set of reforms around member state reform and also about reform within the multilateral system. They provide at least something of a counter measure to these trends, these forces, to bring the world back to multilateralism. And I think whatever you see in the here and now in politics, the international arrangements around the UN and institutions are still very, very strong, right? Though they have not been dismantled. And I think it's there for member states to use those tools to those who believe in multilateralism to ensure that we stay on track. And I want to underline the Pact for the Future last year included some very bold pledges on things like Security Council reform. So the Security Council is not moribund in the face of difficult global conflicts, and also included reforms to the international financial architecture to give greater weight and greater voice to the non-developed world. Although I must admit, Malaysia soon will be a developed country too, as it crosses the income threshold probably in the next 2 or 3 years. So yes, it's a good point you make, but I still think from the other side that these multilateral institutions, and the SDGs is one of them, where we can still unite around. And I think even those disparate voices who you're referring to still believe, I would hope they still believe in the aspirations set out in the goals, right? There's no reason not to think that, right? And I think the goals are still a set of values and aspirations that we can all unite around as humanity. So yes, there are pressures, but I think the goals and other institutions stand against them. But very difficult question, yes. Anybody else? Please don't be shy, honestly. Anything I've said which is outrageous, which people found unacceptable, please, no. Or any part you want to hear more about. Maybe in your own work, no? Another one, go ahead, sir. Oh no, another difficult one.
Another one that I would like to seek your comment or maybe guidance. Your talk just now basically covers the UN, the governments, the CSO, the private sectors. But I think time and again, history has proven that when these structurals or the power that be fails to go towards the right direction, the whole issue will have to be taken by the people. That's why historically we have revolutions, we have all sorts of things. So as far as SDG is concerned, it's not that we are pessimistic to say that the structure and the power that we might not be able to achieve it, or maybe purposely to address it. No. Since this is a global goal, this is humanity's goal. Don't you think that we should bring these people to play more active and significant roles in these efforts? So the discussion should just be all those governments, yes, or private, that one. Maybe we should highlight more on the people, everyone, because at the end of the day, if the thing gets worse, these are the people who will suffer, and normally they are the one who will revolutionize and try to get it, as history has taught.
Yeah, I understand.
Can you?
Yeah, another controversial question. I think I made clear, that the idea of the goals is that they're the business of everybody, right? So it takes whole of society effort, and it's probably also mindful. Maybe I should have a slide about citizens and about people, right? Because it's also about our own conduct, right? So several of the goals aren't about money at all. If I take SDG 12 about sustainable production and consumption, it's all about our sustainable consumption as well as businesses' sustainable production. So we are called on in the goals, to modify our own conduct, to use less plastic, to pollute less, to emit less, right? Just simply by not filling the kettle to the top, filling the kettle to the amount of water you can actually use will save an enormous amount of energy, right? So I think there are a series of personal behaviours that we can take on, and but those also requires a partnership with government too. Government needs to educate us about that. It requires government to have information campaigns, and not maybe just the banal about the kettle. There are things around the conduct of youth or the conduct of families, right? Values which shape societies. So yes, you're right. Citizens matter for the SDGs. Okay, but I think you're pushing me in a more radical direction as well, about whether people power is significant. Okay, and I think that is also somewhat reflected in the SDGs, because if you look in SDG 16, which is about governance, it's about the extent to which decision making is responsive, right? And it's about whether there is representation of all areas, all peoples, of both genders, for example, is very hardwired in that goal and also elsewhere in the SDGs. So there is a representational element within the goals, and they are meant to be inclusive. And I think you find during all debates about the SDGs or consultations, for example, the VNR, the very, very strong efforts to engage, with the public, with citizenry in delivering these reports. Okay, so that's within the frame of the SDGs. So I think that's somewhat answering your question, but I also think you make a good point about whether the problem of underachievement is not only about the SDG framework, right? Why we didn't achieve certain goals, why something like, like the conflict in the Middle East, how does that conflict arise, right? Or we're just simply treating the symptom rather than the cause. So I think you have something in that. But I also think the UN spoke to that agenda too, because if you look at the Pact for the Future last year, okay, the Pact for the Future, I think, has 5 chapters. Only the first chapter is about the SDGs, right? The other chapters are about global governance. Again, it's about the Security Council, about the IFI, it's about the distribution of resources, about the voices given to states. So I think you have something there. There is also a question of equity that the UN is trying to address, I think, through this wider picture. And of course, the Pact says, well, how do we get where we are with the SDGs, with this huge gap 5 years before? The answer is not only in the framework, it's in these, the broader dynamics within the global economy and global governance to change the rules better, make them more fairer, to make decision-making more fairer. And one other thing it does, which is very interesting, it has 2 annexes. One is about technology, about the governance of technology. Because what we're also seeing, if you think about global inequality, one of the drivers of that has been this access to this new technologies, AI, but also Industry 4.0, Internet of Things, these other very radical developments that have taken place. How we make that more democratic, how we can democratize things like that technology between countries and between users. So a very strong focus on technology. And the other annex it had was an annex on youth and future generations. Because traditionally, young people haven't been engaged in governance within the UN, but also, I think, within most member states. And a much stronger focus on how we take account of the views of youth, but also how we take account of future generations. Those people have not yet been born yet. Obviously, we can't consult them because they've not been born. But how do we have a framework that thinks about our future generations? Particularly important in something like climate change, which could be cataclysmic for our children and our children's children, right? So I think you make a good point. I think some of it is in the SDG framework, but there also is this wider question that the UN's trying to grapple with that speaks to the themes that you mentioned. But I also agree there's more to be done, right? I still think people power can be very significant, in shaping decisions and changing the world. So it might sound naive, but I would encourage all of you to kind of engage in this kind of global discussion and debate around things like the SDGs and delivering the world that we want, particularly given the very serious challenges we face. Okay, there's a gentleman there. Oh, do you need to go to the mic? Okay, he's bringing it to you. Very good.
Hello. All right. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. And a very good morning to everybody, especially to Dr. Richard. I am Abang Zainuddin Haji Matuki from resident of Peace Bintulu. I have 3 questions, Doctor. It's just straightforward. So it also, I would like to narrow it to Sarawak Senior. So the first one is what will happen if the SDG are not achieved by 2030? Number two, how might the SDG evolve beyond 2030?
Okay.
And the last one is how can we ensure that future development is both sustainable and inclusive as far as Sarawak concerned? Thank you.
Okay, so the first one, what happens if we don't achieve the goals? Okay, I think, you know, if that happens, right? That's a process, and the only parallel we have is what happened with the MDGs, right? Okay, because some of the MDGs, in aggregate, the MDGs were achieved, right? Okay, but for most countries, the MDGs weren't achieved because you get variation at country level. What you saw with the MDGs, take MDG 1, which was about poverty, almost like SDG 1, almost the same. In aggregate, that was achieved, okay? It was achieved largely because of India and China, you know, because there was enormous poverty reduction in India and China. In that time, I think I was in Vietnam, I'd left Bosnia, but I think in other countries, you didn't see the goal achieved, right? You didn't see it achieved everywhere, but in aggregate terms, we achieved. Now, I think globally, for some things, that isn't a problem, right? So take something like climate change. If some places overachieve, okay, and we reduce the net emission, right, then we're okay, right? I'm a skeptic whether that will happen, but that will still be okay because we're talking about systemic SDG, right? Something which matters more in countries, something I guess like poverty or health, will still deliver very serious consequences for that country, you know, that it's not able to meet its targets. And these are, you know, very basic targets you see within the SDGs. For example, in education, everybody going to school and so forth, everybody having reasonable attainment, you know, everybody having health coverage under the health goal. So, you know, if that happens, it happens. For a systemic goal, it's okay at the aggregate level, but I think that it's still very much a problem at the country level, right? If certain goals aren't achieved. And I guess if it happens, we pick ourselves and carry on. But one useful thing that was done at the end of the MDGs, and I think will happen again, is a stock take. You know, this final accounting of which ones we achieved and which ones we didn't. And one of the starting points for the SDGs was to make good on MDG failings. So priority number one when the SDGs started. And actually that was very powerful because you could say you failed on this, 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 and this, right? And there was a spurt of investment and activity around those very, very basic requirements within the MDGs. I guess the problem is the MDGs were much more basic than SDGs, right? So the challenge in the SDG is on a different level, right? Like I said, the MDG sends things like reduce this by a third, reduce this by 2/3, reduce this by half. Several SDGs literally say eradicate poverty, right? Certainly dollar a day poverty, they say eradicate. National poverty, they say halve, right? That's much more challenging, I think, when we get to the end, but we'll see. But I think that stock-taking process will answer some of the question you're asking me. It will mean that it will give a real priority to governance and globally to get the basic SDG indicators that weren't achieved delivered in the first couple of three years of a new framework if we move to a new framework. And that leads to your second question. What do we do after 2030? Well, I imagine, again, it's a bit like when we move from MDGs to SDGs. We develop a new set of goals, right? That pick up on the old goals, but also reframe the world's problems. Because if you look between MDGs and SDGs, that all the things I mentioned about them being more ambitious, more expansive, and so forth, that's all true. But they also changed a bit. You know, when you had MDGs, there wasn't the priority on climate change. Climate change emerged during the MDG period as an absolutely existential threat. We realized the severity, and then it's hardwired through the whole SDGs, hence the S in the DGs, right? So I imagine we'll move to a new framework that member states will begin working on in the latter years of the SDGs. And then in the same way, we will sign up to those. I think it's also worth us reflecting, though, on SDG delivery, you know, whether it worked, you know, this system, this international system we have of voluntary reviews, all the way through SDGs, you've seen everything's voluntary, right? In fact, the goals themselves are voluntary. You know, countries are even free to delete some goals if they want when they tailor. I mean, sometimes countries do that for good reason. For example, Mongolia has no ocean goal because there's no ocean in Mongolia. It would be silly to have an ocean goal, right? And I think, you know, they don't have certain targets around malarial mosquito, because mosquito cannot survive in the cold, right? So sometimes they drop targets and goals for good reason. But then other countries have dropped goals for political or social reasons specific to them, which is more problematic, I agree. So maybe we need to move to a more prescriptive form in its reiteration. But that process, I think, will be very similar to last time. As they move from MDGs to SDGs, we'll move from SDGs to something else, with an open process of designing a new system. But I think from the UN side, maybe more prescription is needed, maybe something more along the lines of the rules that govern climate change. Commitments are binding in terms of nationally determined contributions to emissions reductions, something that has I guess a sharper performance edge to it. But I can't speculate. This is all in the future, and I'm definitely not speaking with the Secretary General. I know this is being live streamed. Nobody record me, please. But so that's the answer to that question. How can future development be made sustainable and inclusive? Well, there's $1 million question. I mean, like $1 million is not very much these days, so $100 million question. Yeah, I think there are certain things which tend society to being more inclusive and being more sustainable, right? And some basic policy measures that can be taken. So, for example, on the inclusion side, typically we'll think we can achieve greater inclusion by spending more public money and taxing harder, right? We think about the redistributional dimension. But there are certain dimensions to an economy which automatically make it more inclusive, right? For example, the level of labor share in GDP, the amount of human capital we use and how we reward human capital. If we can get to a set of industries and sectors, which deliver, a higher level of wages, obviously for a higher level of input, of skill input, that's naturally more redistributing, naturally more inclusive. And if we give people through education, a skill set that allows them to earn a decent wage, right? If we take these kind of measures outside of redistribution is important too. The tax system should be progressive. The poor should have social welfare transfers, yes, for sure. But there are also certain features, I think, as we know more about inclusive growth, how we can make the economy more inclusive simply by building in basic policy ideas. And often those ideas can be more powerful than us having to redistribute after economic activity has taken place. And they naturally bear down on things like inequality and require greater inclusion. I think also questions like spatial dimension, because if you think about inequality, there's a regular factors, for example, like the labor market, like the distribution of wealth that drive income inequality. They're also very powerful forces simply associated with your spatial position. And if I look in Malaysia, for example, and there's a report last year from the World Bank that showed simply where you are in Malaysia, is 15 or 20% of inequality in Malaysia is likely simply just to be where you are, right? Whether you're like me in KL or you're here in Sarawak, just simply where you are. If you look at the level of inequality, it's just driven by your locality. And that speaks to very serious spatial inequality. I think you all know this, right? It's a long-standing feature in Malaysia. So much stronger efforts, through infrastructure, through connectivity, really can reduce that level of inequality and ensure greater inclusion. And of course, also the same applies to different ethnic groups. Measures to ensure fairness and openness between groups that give everybody an equal opportunity. Those can build on the inclusion side. I think it's also true of the environmental side. There are a certain set of practice and investment strategies that you can incentivize and reward to make the economy greener, more circular, and more sustainable. Whether that's the energy mix we choose, and these technologies often now are becoming, as everybody knows, there's no trade-off here. Well, one time we used to think by green, you'll reduce economic growth. But now these new technologies are cost-effective technologies. Your choice of wind, of solar, of hydro, these are comparable cost technologies to using much dirtier energy generation methods. So simply by the choices you make in terms of mix, also the choices we make as a society, basic things like paying for plastic bags in Malaysia, right? I don't know about you, but it does make me have less plastic, maybe because I'm mean and Scottish originally, but it doesn't make me think about how much plastic I use. So even our own conduct, these basic nudges can be very, very helpful. And that's my advice, essentially, to build these frameworks and rules into law and into social systems and into the budget that ensure that you're inclusive and sustainable, rather than having to take very strong remedial efforts afterwards. Okay, thank you. anymore. Please don't be shy. Okay, one at the front there. Oh no, he's getting the mic.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Dr. Marshall. I'm curious to know in which country in the world that SDG initiatives has been proven to be a success, and can you share what kind of programs or projects that are successful in that country? Thank you.
Okay, very challenging question too. I mean, there are myriad examples, right, of SDG successes, right? But I think countries are known usually for different dimensions of SDG successes, right? I think if you look to Latin America, they've very strongly looked at issues of social protection, very strong alignment on providing social protection income floors. Countries like Mexico with the Oportunidades program, or in Brazil with the Bolsa Familia program, very strong social inclusion dimension that's driven by some of the thinking around labor markets that's within the SDGs, and ensuring an income floor is a very strong, powerful signal. I think on the environment side, you can also find countries which have moved much more strongly towards decarbonizing their economies. Several in Europe like that, places like Finland and so forth, that have really gone much strongly for alternative technologies. Even where I'm from in the UK, the energy mix moves radically towards wind farm and to renewables. So I think you can find these examples all over the world. Sometimes they're not directly mentioned, linked to the SDGs. Perhaps they add the SDGs in afterwards when they have when they frame their success. But I think the SDGs are still very, very powerful in shaping the kind of decisions that promote that. And you can see Latin America had a very strong response to the SDGs in terms of its planning frameworks. Also, there are paragon countries, for example, Bhutan, around gross national happiness, right, that very strongly adopted the SDG framework in their planning. I think Mongolia as well is a good case example of the institutional approach. They have like an SDG law, right, that promotes the SDGs, actually following from their kind of work on the MDGs, a very similar legislative approach. So I think there are myriad countries that do this in different specialisms. I think Sarawak actually is good, because you have the potential to use your green energy potentials as a real kind of SDG signal within Malaysia, and to deliver as well on that agenda. So whether it's you badge it afterwards or whether you use the SDGs, I think is not so significant. But I think the message of the SDGs is the central one of inclusion and of sustainability.
Any more questions? I see the trend here that people apparently are a bit shy to come forward.
Yeah.
So just please raise your hand if you have questions, so our team will bring the mic to you. All right, audience, any questions, any opinions, or any thoughts you want to share?
Yeah, particularly if you disagree with me, that's great. It'd be good to have a debate.
Yes, morning, Dr. Marshall. My name is Fian. I'm from the Asian Pineapple Industry Board, federal government agency under the Ministry of Agriculture and Food Security. Okay, my question is quite simple and straightforward as well. How do you see all the states in Malaysia contributing to Malaysia's success in implementing these SDG goals as compared to Sarawak when you presented this? Thank you.
Okay, you said it was simple, but I think also controversial because people have different views. Yeah. Okay, no worries. Yeah, I think what you've seen in Malaysia is quite strong adoption of the SDGs federally, right? So if you go to the Malaysia development plans, the 12th plan, now the 13th plan, the SDGs are all over them. I mean, they tend to think of the government strategy then like the previous question about countries and SDGs. They badge them as SDG, even though they were doing them anyway, right? But I think you see over federal government materials and their attempts to tag the budget to the SDGs, for example, that's fairly strong. So federally, I think SDGs is at least influential, if not a driver, in terms of thinking. And I think also if you look at something like Malaysia Madani, the government's Anwar Ibrahim's overriding strategy. That's very SDG-like. It talks about raising the floor, raising the ceiling. Has very SDG language. You could very quickly map the goals. But the same is also true of the post-COVID-19 development strategy. You didn't do it in Sarawak, but I just did it for you. You can easily map the goals. Now, outside of Sarawak, though, I think that's it's less clear with some of the other state plans. Okay, I mean, it varies, right? But you see the SDGs less taken up, I think, at the state level, and perhaps less so at the local level, at the city level, the district level as well, right? And I think that's the task of government and UN, as we, in the last 5 years, because delivery of the SDGs, with its public services, where its sustainability is actually at the local level, where we get our services, in the communities we live, our conduct is very much shaped more at the local level. So I think that's our challenge, and your question is a good one, because it's, how do we move towards that? And I think there are variations. I think I've said Sarawak's plan is a good example, right? It might be made more SDG-like, but it is speaking to the themes of the SDGs. I think Selangor's practice with its VLR, this SDG reporting is a good practice, and we need to expand those elsewhere. But one observation, right, and perhaps more controversial now, some of the states with greater challenges have less SDG focus. I mean, maybe that's because they are focused on their much more serious challenges. But, Sarawak is, good at green energy, so it has a plan about green energy, right? It doesn't have a green energy problem. Where you really want to see the purchase of the SDGs, its impact is somewhere which doesn't have green energy, that doesn't have sustainability, or a state that has much higher levels of poverty. And I think it's true that they have been less engaged, I guess because they're more focused on the challenges they face, and see the SDG framework as somewhat, more for some kind of ephemeral, some kind of global idea rather than one that's relevant to them. And I think it's a task for us in the UN, working with government officials as well, to deliver that to the state level and deliver that also to the local level. One area I think I mentioned where I wasn't brave, pardon me, was around data tracking, at the state level. I'm able to produce those charts, for the world and for Malaysia, right? Someone's producing those charts. I think a good place to start would be to produce those kind of charts for the states. So the states having their own SDG tracker, and that will reveal to them where the challenges are. But you make a very good point. I think it's patchy between states, and it's something we really need to address, particularly those where some of these challenges exist.
Good morning.
Oh yeah, I see you.
Okay.
Hello.
Hello. Good morning, Dr. Richard Marshall and everyone. So my name is Marshall from Sarawak Federal Secretary Office. So my question is, I want to touch about the climate change. Right, since the withdrawal of USA from the Paris Treaty recently, which they have done before in 2020, if I'm not mistaken. So what does the UN stands for that decision? And also, since Sarawak also had established the Sarawak Climate Change Center, so how does the UN, based on the SDG, see these efforts? And my last question is, so is there any effort from the UN through this SDG to persuade or to instill the climate change controlling, or how the UN try to control the climate change drastic effect on the world or global? So that's all from me. Thank you.
Okay, so I think 3 questions. So first on the US withdrawal from the Paris Agreement. As you rightly note, this already happened previously in 2020. I won't lie. It's a problem. I can't avoid the issue. It's a problem that a major emitter like the United States, the major consumer country like the United States, leaves the agreement. That's a significant development. Okay. However, the agreement is pretty robust in terms of participation from other countries, and the agreement remains in place, and others have committed to the agreement, and there are very significant parties to the agreement still in place. The US is not China is still a member of the agreement. Others have still committed to the agreement, so the agreement carries on regardless. I also think it's worth noting the United States. Thanks very much. The United States, in leaving the agreement, hasn't then committed to radically increasing emissions, right? It might have left the agreement, but I think it's not fully clear where we are in terms of the emission position, right? That will then pan out over time. So I don't think it's quite as cataclysmic as some people describe, given the agreement stays in place and the US is not, as far as I'm aware, planning to perform a volte-face. I think the US policymakers still accept the case for climate change. They just don't buy into the agreement, is my understanding of their position. But I also have to say the UN has no formal position, has simply noted the US agreement. The UN is not critical in any way or has made any definitive comment. Certainly not one that I'm aware of, so I'm not going to begin now by doing that. But I think it's important you bear these two dimensions in mind. The agreement survives, and it's not the case that the US plans to go off on some trajectory which is radically different to the rest of the world. Well, that's where we are now. In terms of Sarawak, I think Sarawak's very, very commendable in terms of climate change and using its natural resource base to further sustainability. It's extremely positive in Malaysia. I think the UN has not been so much engaged with these structures yet, but I'm sure we'd be happy to engage. I'd be happy to connect to the UN Environment Programme or UNDP who work on these issues with the Climate Change Centre. And it's very much in Malaysian thinking. Sarawak, to reiterate again, is very much central to greening Malaysia's energy portfolio. So very, very much welcome. I think your final question, I think you were asking about how the UN would discipline people, right? How would they be harder, right? Okay, yeah, very challenging. So there's no good answer to that question, right? I mean, the way the framework exists now is really, it's more like a kind of peer pressure approach where people declaring their own contribution, reporting their contributions, right? So it's more kind of globally embarrassing for you to do that. But I think, and you're required, when you declare a contribution also to set out in a plan how you will achieve it, right? So there is, and write it into your own law, right? You don't just say, I'm going to make net zero. You need to say how you plan to get to net zero, within your planning framework, within your adaptation plan, your mitigation plans. So there is substance because it's, then written into your own policy stance. I guess there is a debate always about how you would toughen the sanctions around these. And I think that's an ongoing discussion globally. But I think right now it remains one of voluntary declaration. And then the pressure is that you don't live up to the agreements, right? That you would be, questioned or you would be held to account, in international fora for not, it is effectively a treaty, right? And the treaties work in the same way, right? Whether some sanctions applied is not currently the position, but those levers would be available to the world, presumably. But I'm not in a position to comment on that again. I sound like a very diplomatic answer, probably like the others, but I can't go further than that, I'm afraid. Let me get some water. Okay, I'm good. Any more questions? Please don't be shy. We still have...
Dr. Richard,
yeah.
we have one question
Okay,
that we
great.
received online.
Okay, great.
And then the question is your opinion on SDG coverage, as it appears that it only covers the third world countries.
Okay. The answer to that is no. Okay, maybe I'm going to make it strongly at the start when I introduced the SDG 101. A great advantage of the SDGs is that they are inclusive of everybody, right? The previous MDG framework, the question online is right, was more about the developing world, right? Okay, it spoke to developing world challenges. But the SDGs is inclusive, okay, and it is universal. It applies to every single member state. So it applies as much to Germany as it applies to Malaysia, as it applies to Vietnam. Every single member state is subject to the SDGs. Every single member state signed onto the Sustainable Development Agenda. And they also produce SDG data. So if you go to SDG data online, you could access even country profiles for Spain or Togo. You know, there's data for everybody, and they're all held to the same targets. Now, at the same time, I want to make clear that targets are differentiated, right? We don't expect a developing country, the framework doesn't expect a developing country to perform the same way as a developed country. So the targets are framed to the local circumstance. And countries then also adapt them when they take them on board in their own planning framework. Like I explained, Mongolia deleted ocean goal, right? Because it would be absurd. So my answer is, they apply to all, but they're also differentiated between countries. And this is a defining feature of the SDGs as opposed to the MDGs. Good question, though.
Any more questions? Anyone want to make any sharing on SDG?
Yes, we'll have the very final question now.
All right. So we shall move on. Thank you for your thoughtful questions and some controversial questions. And a big thank you to Dr. Richard Marshall for sharing his expertise and insight. And we truly appreciate the engaging discussion. With that, we conclude the Q&A session. Now, as a token of our appreciation, we would like to invite Yang Berusaha Tuan Haji Jafri Bujang Mazli, Chief Executive Officer of Pustaka Negeri Sarawak, to present the token of appreciation.
Thank you very much.
So you asked the most difficult questions. Okay, they bring you.
Oh, from there.
Yeah.
Only there. Must be in the middle.
Yeah.
Photography.
Not me.
Thank you, Yang Berusaha Tuan Haji Jafri, and once again, our heartfelt appreciation to Dr. Richard Marshall for his time and valuable insights. Gentlemen, you may now return to your seats.
Tersergam indah
Now, before
megah
we wrap up, we will now
jadi
proceed with a good
kebanggaan kita, bukti wawasan dicita, maklumat dan pengetahuan, penuh terhimpun harta ilmu untuk kita terokan. Pustaka Negeri Sarawak, wadah ilmu untuk semua, bersama kita manfaatkannya. Pustaka Negeri Sarawak, berteknologi dan berusaha, berkhidmat ikhlas untuk kita. Pustaka Negeri Sarawak. Tersergam indah megah jadi kebanggaan kita, bukti wawasan dicipta, maklumat dan pengetahuan, penuh terhimpun harta ilmu untuk kita taruhkan. Pustaka Negeri Sarawak, wadah ilmu untuk semua, bersama kita manfaatkannya. Pustaka Negeri Sarawak, berteknologi dan berusaha, berhikmat ikhlas untuk kita. Pustaka Negeri Sarawak.